Hey everybody, I'm here with Alex Epstein, the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. First of all, I'm just completely impressed with anyone who's written an entire book. Start to finish, published, looks good.
It's actually just a picture book, but...
Yeah, I know. I haven't read it, so I have no idea what's inside. No, I have. I mean, I would, if I started and finished and got a book published, I would never stop talking about it.
Really?
Yeah.
Have you read people's books? I mean, most books are horrible.
That's still an impressive thing. I got a couple of friends who've written books, and I sense instantly that it can't be done. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I find that weird. I never wanted to become a writer as a kid. I always wanted to become a scientist or a businessman or an athlete. That was disqualified quite quickly.
Yeah, sure.
But I think if you care about the issue, you should write a book. But I think people often write a book for vanity, and that just leads to me being bored.
I would definitely write the book for vanity. There's no...
I'll go for it.
That's my sole motivation. All right, well, let's talk about the moral case for fossil fuels. First of all, tell me about the Center for Industrial Progress. That's the think tank you founded.
Sure. So in about 2011, I decided, after having discussed these kinds of issues for many, many years, that there needed to be a positive alternative to what we can call the green movement. The green movement teaches us that our goal in terms of our relationship with nature should be to minimize our impact. And I've always believed that no, our focus should be on maximizing human well-being and impacting nature as much as we need to be well off, and then of course minimizing negative impacts. And there was no voice out there that was saying anything positive about human progress and industrial progress. There were a lot of conservatives who were just fighting the kind of negative battle. So I wanted to inspire people about, hey, here's how we can transform the planet in an intelligent way so that we can have the best possible economy and the best possible environment.
Would you concede that most people in the green movement are most concerned, though, about, as you say, sort of as best we can, protecting humans on this planet?
I don't think so, but I think you have to divide the movement from the culture and then the leadership of the movement from the membership of the movement. I think the higher you go up in the movement, and I have lots of quotations from many of the leaders in the moral case for fossil fuels, you do see a very definite view that our goal should be to minimize our impact and the consequences of that, including population reduction.
But the goal of minimizing the impact is to increase life expectancy, which we've made great progress on so far, and to make lives better for the people who are living them. When I hear minimize our impact on the environment, it's with the desired effect of protecting the people living in that environment.
I think that's an understandable response because there are many negative impacts human beings can have on our environment, and people are legitimately concerned with those. But I think what the green movement does is it takes that concern and it packages it with something very different, which is the idea that transforming nature as such is a bad thing. So you see people opposing things like buildings, power plants, any kind of development as such. And what that points to is it's not focused on negative impacts for humans. It's focused on the planet is perfect. We shouldn't make a footprint.
I don't think those people have any power. I don't worry about those people. I mean, I don't know whether I'd consider myself an environmentalist. I'd consider myself an environmentalist. I'm certainly not active in the movement, and I learned a lot from reading your book. I learned a lot from reading from people who disagree with your book. But first of all, the political power structure in the United States of America is pro-building, pro-progress, pro-go. There aren't a lot of people in a significant position of power that are standing in the way of building things.
I mean, I think this is just empirically untrue. So if you look at, say, different parts of the United States, people trying to build projects, and you have things like the sage grouse or the prairie chicken, which are these obscure forms of species, the kind that go into existence and come out of existence.
That stuff has gotten in the way of legitimate, genuine progress in this Congress?
For sure. I mean, people's livelihoods are destroyed by that kind of thing. You have anti-logging people. You're not allowed to drill in many, many places. Even solar and wind. You have the Chamber of Commerce. They have a site. I think it's called projectnoproject.com. You have huge amounts of anti-industrial opposition even to solar and wind.
I know a lot of developers, unbelievably lately, just through a couple of strange things in my life, has led me to friendships with a lot of developers. They're all conservatives, generally, because they don't want regulation. They don't want the prairie grass or the mutton chop elf. An elf is not an animal, but you know what I'm saying. They don't want those things getting in the way of, and they get around it. They get stuff done.
Well, Yeah, so any individual businessman does. The question is, with the productivity of the society, does that happen? So an example I give in the book, which I think indicates this mentality, is a story from India, which is a place that's starting to industrialize, but certainly of hundreds of millions of people without electricity. And they talk about a story where they're trying to build a road, which is something, of course, that we've done all the time. They're trying to cut down trees, and there's a whole movement against them doing that says, and this is very revealing, everything is environment. And this is the idea that the environment is something superior to us that we are not allowed to modify. Versus my view, which is no, we should modify our environment as much as possible insofar as it's necessary to meet human needs. And I think we'll see that with the fossil fuel discussion, what happens is people aren't really thinking of it in terms of human life. They're thinking of it in terms of we're not allowed to modify nature. And I think that drives the fear over catastrophic climate change. I think that drives a lot of other things.
My fear is human life. My fear is not that.
I believe you. So we'll
but I believe but I'm getting that from leaders. So you and I are hearing different things.
Well, I mean, so chapter 1 of the book, chapter 9 of the book.
You got some quotes in there, but I mean, you found some quotes, and I know those people who don't want those trees built in India. I don't doubt that don't want those trees built, don't want those trees taken down in India. I know those people exist. I know you're not making that up. I don't think those people are powerful.
I mean, I think they are thought leaders, but for my part, I can just discuss how I think of it primarily. Me trying to give an intellectual biography of every person and impute their motives. That's an easier thing to do in a book length. But I do think their methodology is very wrong, and I think that'll be borne out as we discuss the concrete controversies.
So where does the Center for Industrial Progress get its money?
Well, so that's important because people usually say funding, which is so we're a for-profit, and I'm very public about that.
Yes,
and people think that that's something to be ashamed of. I think if you're doing, but so the core idea of it was, if you look at the most influential people in the world, for the most part, they are people, whether I agree with them or not, who can make money on the free market. So let's take Paul Krugman. So he's a professor at Princeton, but most of his income comes from, say, being a popular columnist for the New York Times. The New York Times makes more money with him than it would without him. And so looking to people like that, I thought, well, if my ideas are really good and I can persuade people of them, I should be able to make money. I shouldn't need to be funded by somebody. So that was sort of the core insight, and that led me, I think, to be a much more effective communicator. But then on top of that, I just want to specify, because it might come up, my goal from the beginning, and this has been borne out, is I also wanted to be paid by industry to help them with their messaging. So I don't represent industry, but I very aggressively and proudly want to charge them money so that they will change their messaging, because it is awful.
I got you, and I think it's a really clever idea, independent of whether I think it's right or whether anybody thinks it's right, sort of making an effective, pleasant-faced, if I may, coherent, thoughtful message, and of course doing it aggressively. Again, the moral case for fossil fuels, the title of the book. Not you're trying to seize the conversation, which always works politically in America, 95% of the time. So you might not win in the end, but or you might, but in the process, I imagine it'll make you pretty rich. And I think that was sage thinking. So I get it. You're not funded by the industry.
It's funny, by the way, it's just funny because when you grow up, like the way these things happen is since 18 years old, I've had these views, been poor, nobody listens to it. And once you finally get it, like a formula that works, it's like, oh, it's so obvious, it's so clever. And before this will never work. Parents, relatives, how could you possibly go into this? It's always a fun trajectory.
But critically, you have to be able to carry the message effectively. You have to have a good message, and then almost more important than that, the carrier of that message. That's what presidential elections are about. Almost every political election is the carrier of that message effective at carrying the message.
I'm not even particularly political myself, although this election I want to try to get involved, but take the issue we're dealing with. I mean, we're dealing with an issue with fossil fuels and climate and all these related issues where we have both sides saying that there's a catastrophe if you don't do the wrong thing, and there's a really big upside if you do the right thing.
What we're talking about now, climate change, this is not an easy conversation for any news program. It is complicated. Both sides have statistics. Both sides have charts. You got a lot of charts. And that is not conducive to a 90-second, 2-minute, 2.5-minute news story.
Well, I don't know about that, because I've seen a lot of things that get coverage in terms of fire and brimstone. You have movies Day After Tomorrow. You have An Inconvenient Truth. People get a lot of attention over it.
Inconvenient Truth was at least, it was an hour 45. I mean, it took time. I mean,
That's true, but particularly when storms come up, I mean, Superstorm Sandy, you certainly had that narrative, the number one thing being focused on. In general, people who are opposed to different kinds of technologies, including nuclear, you see that all the focus is there. I mean, for example, the Green Movement is even more anti-nuclear than anti-fossil fuels in most cases. And with Fukushima, what you had a tsunami that kills 20,000 people. And the nuclear plant directly, and we can discuss indirectly, doesn't kill anybody. And I don't think indirectly we had any deaths. And historically, nuclear is the safest form of energy ever devised, far safer than fossil fuels or solar or wind or whatever. And everyone just focuses on, oh my gosh, this nuclear radiation is going to kill everybody. So I think there are these hell narratives that we have associated with our technology is going to kill us.
So, sure, we have some. We also have a daily barrage of technology has changed our lives. Every single commercial, every single celebration of Apple. There's been 7 Steve Jobs movies in the last 3 years, and they're all, the toughest thing they might say is he might have been an ass. But this is all celebratory. Every commercial you see, every car commercial. I mean, I don't. You're going to have a tough time convincing me that the energy industry is under siege.
Well, it's interesting because you are, I think, correctly lumping these things together under technology. And what's interesting is that was done in the 70s, where they talked about all the different forms of energy, including fossil fuels, as technologies, and talked about, because technology is really the modification of nature to suit human purposes. But today we kind of equate technology with digital technology, which we tend to have a favorable view of, and people don't think it has any environmental impacts, which is completely bizarre, but nevertheless, they just think of it in isolation. And then there's this other realm of energy, and that's thought of as industry. So there's this dichotomy between, it's a false dichotomy between industry and technology, and generally industry has the hostility, and technology is viewed as good. And I don't think that's coherent, but I think it's part of the reason why when people see a big industrial project, they tend to have negative feelings and are prone to believe something catastrophic. And when they see technology, they're prone to believe something positive.
Fukushima, would you deny that there was a genuine risk, that it needed to be talked about and watched?
Well, yeah, but there are lots of things with genuine risks.
Well, let's talk about this one.
But the interesting thing to me is how they get prioritized in relation to the amount of risk that they actually pose. So what you had with Fukushima was you had a certain kind of fairly old reactor design. But one of the things we know, just the way the reactor works, is that it can overheat and have a meltdown. Now, importantly, that is usually a much safer process than what can happen with other sorts of things, including, let's say, a natural gas plant, where you can have explosions. So that the great advantage of nuclear is that the way that it works is that it cannot explode, and that you have lots of reaction time when something goes wrong.
I'm not really prepared or terribly interested in debating whether the upside of nuclear energy. I don't disagree with you. Mm-hmm. But the notion that wasn't a genuine risk that involved an entire town.
Well, no, it's a risk locally, but the question is, does a nuclear accident justify a fundamental questioning of nuclear power? For instance, in Germany, you had immediately after a commitment.
You don't think it would necessitate a questioning of nuclear power?
Not of the fundamental technology, because nothing happened that was at all technologically interesting. It's the same with 3 Mile Island. You had nobody die except for the stress caused by all the fear mongers and the unnecessary evacuations in many cases. No, so
what about Chernobyl?
So in that case, you have a fundamentally different situation where there's no containment vessel. But even there, that was known that could happen. And you're talking about under 60 deaths there compared to what you can have in many, many other situations. So the interesting thing to me is not that there's no risk. It's that any situation where there's an accident is used to question the fundamental technology, which to me points to a bias against it. Because when you have a car crash, which is a real danger to our lives, on a daily basis, we don't question cars. Even when a gas line explodes, we don't question gas to heat our homes. Maybe they will in the future. So I'm always looking for where are people being prejudiced in their thinking? And I think that with a lot of industry, and particularly with fossil fuels and nuclear, you find an enormous amount of prejudice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it in fossil fuels, but I hear it in nuclear.
Well,
with nuclear.
we'll talk about fossil fuels then.
I got you, but it doesn't strike me as a giant prejudice. I mean, fossil fuels gave us an industrial world that we all celebrate in, and that allows these cameras to work, and you know, it puts us where we are. But the situation changed, as it does, and so it strikes me that it would be reasonable. Just because of everything great that has happened because of fossil fuels doesn't mean that we can't then say, hey, now they might be causing a problem. What other things can we do now going forward?
Well, we just need to think carefully about that. I mean, everything you just said. So you said you're talking about the past tense. So this is the fastest growing technology in the world in the energy realm. Even coal, in particular, is the fastest growing energy technology in the world. So this is not something that was, in the past, and I'm sort of stuck in it. It's something that most people are using more of,
Sure.
anticipating a future. In a world where it's important to note, for everyone to have the same amount of energy as the average American, you need 4 times more energy. So what you have here is then a technology that, for various reasons, is still the leading edge technology in the world in terms of energy. And so if you're talking about risks, then you need to consider those. You need to consider those carefully. You can't just say, there's a risk. You need to see how big is that? Sure. How does it compare to the benefit?
Because they're fastest growing, you've also presented the case for what would incentivize that industry to minimize the risks and to tell people, no, there are no risks, because it's not in the past. It's happening now. That's a huge motivation for an incredibly powerful industry to get up and say, no, we're fine. We haven't caused any of these problems.
Well, it's an incentive. I mean, it's an incentive for both the producers and consumers. I mean, anytime you have a product that's the cheapest in the market, both consumers and producers have an interest in it. I mean, with this issue, I think it's important for everyone to recognize that we all have, insofar as there's anything wrong, we all have responsibility for it. We're not forced to use fossil fuels. Now, it is the dominant technology, so we have many positive reasons.
Consumers are largely forced to use
No,
what's available.
300 years ago, no fossil fuels. Anyone is welcome to go back to that. Anyone is welcome, and insofar as solar and wind.
But nobody's talking about going back to that. That's not. I mean, that's
no,
not.
but they're making decisions. I mean, if you were doing a bad enough thing, if you were going to destroy the whole planet in 10 years, then you would have to be willing to go back to a much lower standard of living because the risk would be catastrophic.
Sure. I'm going to leave out the planet ending in 10 years part. I see a greater incentive for the fossil fuel industry to minimize the effects of global warming and climate change than I do for the green movement to exacerbate those. And I don't
think it's close.
I don't think it's close either.
I know. Well, we disagree which way it's close, because I think overwhelmingly the people who have devoted their entire careers to saying that this is evil and to promoting anti-fossil fuel policies, that is their whole identity, that is their whole self-esteem. And I've debated these guys and I see how they respond. Let's put it this way. I have never seen one of them, when confronted with new data about the actual impact of climate on human life over time, which they claim has gotten worse and empirically has gotten better in terms of human life by a large margin. I've not seen one of them crack a smile or have their eyes light up at the prospect of things getting better.
You're talking about that climate damage chart, right? Am I correct?
Climate-related deaths. But I'm just saying, nobody is even excited in that movement. There's never even any hope.
It doesn't sound like it didn't strike me as honest on your part. As intellectually honest.
Well, that would be a good thing to discuss, but I'm just saying my experience with them is there's no hope. Here's the thing, there's no hope that the problem is worse. They're always eager for it to be worse. So this happened with what they call the pause. And there's no sense of despair or loss at the prospect of losing fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are leading edge technology for a reason. They're the most resource efficient way to produce energy for the vast majority of people around the world. If it turned out they were causing a climate catastrophe and we had to take action, that would mean we'd also be causing a human/energy catastrophe. So the fact that nobody is mourning the potential loss of fossil fuels points to me that they're not really focused on human life. They're focused on their own dogma, which is thou shalt not modify nature.
To what end are they focused on their own dogma?
Well, there's a couple of ends. First of all, they believe it and people get entrenched in their beliefs. And then there's a deep psychology of not really valuing human life. I mean, this is not...
Your argument is that most people in the environmental movement do not really value human life?
In practice, absolutely, they do not value human life. That is, the actions that they take are not consistent with it. But more importantly, the leadership who's drawing in people who care about human life on an emotional level, they do not. And I think this is definitively showed in their actions and is definitively showed in the moral case for fossil fuels. But let's be concrete. We're talking about proposals to limit between 70 and 95% of today's fossil fuel use in the next, 20, 25 years.
Most reasonable proposals, I got it. You're talking about some people in leadership.
No, the UN, Barack Obama, they talk 80+% by the year 2050 in a world with a growing population.
I read 50%, but we'll find out more next month in Paris, or in December in Paris.
50,
right?
20, any of these things in a world that needs more energy, where 3 billion people have absolutely no energy. These are proposals that millions or hundreds of millions of people are going along with. If those proposals get enacted, those people will have done irreparable damage to billions of human beings. That means they are anti-human life in action, even if they don't realize it intellectually.
Yeah, but these proposals, I mean, look, I'll agree if the end result is that we have not been able to supplant that technology. The idea is that there would be cleaner technologies that would replace that technology, not that we would simply say, you can't turn on the lights anymore, you can't drive your car to the hospital anymore, you can't get your cancer drugs delivered anymore.
Well, it's interesting then to look at what is the mechanism by which they quote unquote want to supplant it, because you take the green movement, the leadership, two of the biggest technologies that they're against are nuclear power and hydroelectric power. They do far more than every other force on the earth combined to slow down those technologies. And what that indicates is, again, they're not focused on human life. And if you look at their opposition to nuclear, they'll say it's unnatural. We shouldn't be modifying nature. If you look at their opposition to hydro, you see we can't change nature. We can't change the dam. So it's all about not changing nature. It's not caring about human beings who survive by changing nature.
All right, I don't. That strikes me as I hear you, but I don't. You have tough time.
Explain to me why someone who thinks climate catastrophe is the biggest problem in the world and vehemently opposes and certainly does nothing to defend the only two resource-efficient non-carbon forms of energy.
Because they think that that's going to lead to the catastrophe, and they want to replace it with something that won't.
They think nuclear is going to lead to the catastrophe? They think hydro is going to lead to the catastrophe?
They think that other things will. They think fossil fuels will lead to the catastrophe. There are plenty of people who. There's a reasonable argument that I've had, and again, I'm not totally familiar with the leaders of the environmental movement, but the only relevant people are governments that will enact legislation that will actually.
Okay, how much does the UN talk about promoting nuclear?
Probably not very much.
Probably not. So you have Germany.
But you also have a huge problem with nuclear energy, which is what to do with the waste, and it's incredibly expensive.
I mean, that's an assertion. It's not true.
It's not. That's not a problem. What to do with the waste?
No, the waste is a very small amount. It can be recycled or it can be disposed of in a very compact area. There's nothing uniquely scary on a physical level about nuclear. This goes back to the anti-change mentality. People are afraid of it because it's radioactive and that's somehow human beings manipulating.
Well, I hear you on that. I don't disagree with you. I'm not.
But you said it's impossible to deal with the waste. That's just empirically false.
I didn't say it's impossible
a million
to deal with
safe
the waste.
places.
I said that it's expensive to deal with the waste, which is an argument that many people make.
It's not. It's just empirically, it's not particularly expensive. The thing that makes it expensive is that it takes 20 or 25 years to possibly get the approval to do one of these things because it's considered unnatural by the people who claim to care about non-carbon energy. So it's definitively proven that the green movement is not focused on non-carbon energy. They're focused on what they consider natural energy, and that's why solar and wind are appealing, even though they are the two biggest energy failures of the last 100 years, because they're not renewables, they're unreliables.
So obviously, I'm sure you saw the Citigroup, third biggest bank, said this month it's going to cut back on financing for coal mining, on financing for coal mining projects. That was damaging news, right?
Well, I mean, damaging news is the entire industry has been destroyed, I mean, hugely by the Obama administration. I mean, that was Obama's, I believe in 2008, he pledged to bankrupt the industry, and he has largely succeeded. I mean, the entire coal industry is smaller now than one oil company.
Citigroup had a lot of people in this study, a lot of experts in the study, different people from different walks of life. Why would their argument was that it actually is slightly cheaper. The prices were almost identical. I think 190.2 trillion before 2040, or 192 trillion before 2040. That it costs more money to take action to have a significantly smaller carbon imprint.
I didn't read the study, so I don't know how much of it was just based on the pure economics of the current situation, including the policy situation, and how much of it was the CO2. So what was the role of the CO2 in that?
That it would be to have a significant reduction in CO2 by 2040. It was essentially to have a to avoid 2 degrees of warming by 2040. That it would cost 192 trillion to do nothing and 190.2 trillion to take action.
Yeah, so with something like Citigroup, so we have to realize, obviously Citigroup
Plus
is
then
not
they said the huge benefits then at the end, they say, of actually taking the action.
Okay, so Citigroup is just a banking group, right? It just deals with finances, deals with investing things, selling different sorts of financial instruments. Obviously has no expertise whatsoever, no distinctive expertise on climate prediction. So the question is, where are they getting this 2-degree thing? Where are they getting that's some important threshold? Where are they getting that a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere will lead to that? And that goes to the whole issue of what we can call the climate prediction establishment, which is a whole, a set of claims about this many CO2 emissions will lead to this much temperature, which will lead to catastrophe. And if we want to examine them, I guess the first thing to ask is, what is the track record of that establishment? What is the track record of the climate prediction establishment? And as I illustrate in the book, clearly, and as is fairly well known within the community, their climate prediction models have the fatal flaw of not being able to predict climate. And not just by a little, but by a lot. Let alone their higher order claims about 2 degrees leading to catastrophe, which is just completely baseless.
Is the globe warming?
Yeah, the average temperature goes up. I mean, it's been going up for hundreds of years, and in the last 150, it's gone up by about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit.
August was the warmest August ever.
So there are disputes about these things, but anytime you're on an upslope, hold on a second. Let's just take the 1930s, right? So the 1930s is a time with insignificant CO2 emissions, and it's a period of time, through the beginning of the century to that part of the century where people can't really explain why it got significantly warmer. But that's when you had some of the biggest climate disasters in history. That's when you had the Dust Bowl, that kind of thing. So you had natural, non-man-made warming there, and at any given point there, you could have said, oh, it's the hottest August in history, we should be terrified. So history, by the way, is a very short amount of time. In the context of the globe, we're at a very low point in terms of temperature. So absolutely, when you're on an upslope of any kind of function, whether it's natural or man-made, any given month could be the hottest on record. That's not interesting.
So every month
that's
since
just
February
hysterical.
1985 has been hotter than the long-term average. That's 360 months better now than 360 months. That's
long-term average over what term?
Than the long-term average of the temperature. I don't know.
Well, but the period is important. If you're saying 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 20 years.
So it's 360 months in a row that have been hotter than the long-term average.
I know, but at least I'll tell you with the statistic I'm familiar with that Bill McKibben uses, he'll say that, well, it's.
I got this from the National Oceanic Atmospheric.
Oh, no, but he might have been citing it from them. I'm just saying, but yeah, of course, if you're on an upward trend and you take one 50-year chunk or 25-year chunk and you compare it to the overall thing or the first part of it, obviously it's always going to be warmer on average. That's incredibly uninteresting.
So you figured this out, and the 97 or 98% of peer-reviewed studies, they don't have it.
I mean, come on, you know this is in the book. So let me frame this. First of all, the concern here has to be human life. What is going to maximize human well-being? Just give me a second. And to do this, what we have to do is we have to look carefully at what are the unique positives of fossil fuels and what are the unique negatives of fossil fuels compared to our alternatives. And we need to look at those carefully. So with CO2 is a byproduct of using fossil fuels. It's called an infrared absorber. So it leads to a certain amount of heat, more heat being in the atmosphere. And so the interesting, important question to ask is, how consequential is that? So we've increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04% of the atmosphere. How consequential is that? How big is it? Is it positive? Is it negative? How consequential? And so that's my context. So if you say it's warming, sure, you would expect that. You put some more infrared absorbers in the atmosphere, you'd get some warmth. What's interesting, or one of the interesting things, is how mild the warming has been. A lot of the warming has been before significant CO2 emissions. In the last 18 or so years, there's been very little warming, even though you've had record amounts of CO2 emissions, record growth in CO2 emissions. And so what you see is that this is a relatively inconsequential side effect compared with something that has such unique positives that if you lost it, billions of people would be hurt. So that the benefits so far outweigh the risks. The fact that we're concentrating on, oh, it's a little warmer now than it was 60 years ago. Well, how much warmer?
Well, August was 1.58 degrees above the 20th century average, hottest August we'd ever had, breaking the record.
No, we've ever had with modern instrumentation. Not that the planet has ever had. By planetary standards, it's super cold right now.
You understand that the environmentalists, that people who are concerned about this, say that you say it's a random 30 years. I'm not saying it's a random 30 years. It's the last 30 years. This is the 30 years we're living. This is when they say the effects have begun to manifest themselves.
You're on a warming trend for hundreds of years, though, so it's no surprise. But even if we had caused it, the point is it's mild, and the point is, why don't you care about the catastrophic losses we would suffer from following these unreliables?
Because I don't think you're correct, and I don't think you know either. You say they don't know. I would argue that you don't know either.
What don't I know?
What the catastrophic effects would be if we provided no energy to these people. Then I agree.
Well, that's what's happening now.
What do you mean that's what's happening now? You just said that the fossil fuel industry was this rapidly growing industry. We're providing this energy.
Right. So it's brought billions out of poverty in the last 30 years or so.
Billions out of poverty?
Yeah.
We have billions fewer people in poverty than we had 30 years ago?
Well, I mean, their level of poverty has decreased dramatically. China and India, you've got over 2.5 billion people in those countries combined. You've got life expectancy up by over 6 years in both. You've got income dramatically up. And not coincidentally, you have fossil fuel use increasing by 5 times with oil, 5 times with coal. So,
right, but life expectancy hasn't increased because of fossil fuels.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it's increased. It's increased because we're able to communicate with people because we've invented vaccines. We've vaccinated people. That's almost bigger than anything else.
Let's talk about something that I think is very undervalued in this, which is the value of energy. So why is it so important to have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy?
It is important to have cheap, reliable. You don't need to convince me of that. I agree.
I think I do, because I don't think you get the magnitude of it. And I assume this is why you called me manipulative in my use of climate-related deaths, which I want to talk about whenever you want to ask about it.
We can talk about it now.
Yeah, but let's get to the nature of energy. So you say it wasn't fossil fuel energy, it was vaccines and communication. So to me, there's something missing in terms of getting how significant energy is, because energy is our ability to use machines to do work for us to improve our lives. So what that does is that makes every single industry more productive. Energy is the industry that powers every other industry. It's the technology that powers every other technology. It's the resource that makes possible the expansion of every other resource. So you can point to everything: agriculture, manufacturing, the proliferation of goods. All of this is necessarily tied to more access to energy. But as is things like innovation, having more time, developing communications technologies, you cannot do that. Leaving aside that communication is completely powered around the world by fossil fuels, you cannot do that without more energy. So the fact that energy correlates so well to every metric of human well-being is not an accident, and it's not me juxtaposing things on a graph unfairly. It's a fact about the nature of energy that people don't appreciate.
Yeah, but there's no, well, I mean, I do appreciate it, and the contributions of fossil fuels to get us where we are has been profound, and that seems like an understatement.
Well, they're keeping us where we are in the future.
The question comes, how do we produce energy going forward? You would say we don't change anything. We allow the fossil fuel industry to continue to grow, and they'll continue to grow, and I presume you're going to say that they will continue to be as safe as conceivably possible, correct?
Well, I don't have that view of action at all. So this is what I would call a statist view. A statist view of action is to think that if you leave people free, that counts as not taking action. So what I want is I want energy liberation. I want everyone to be free to compete to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. So if the solar industry is able to do that, great. If the wind industry is able to do that, great. But what I do not want are energy deprivation policies that prevent us from using the forms of energy that we want to use.
Nobody is, as far as I know, interested in preventing us from having energy going forward. So
disagree.
All right. Well, we're going to
Chapter 9.
We're going to disagree. I know. I read it. I got it. I don't see that, because if your presumption is, if your argument is going to stop that if we do this, we won't have any energy, well, you'll probably win that argument. If it turns out you're right, then we'll go back to fossil fuels because we'll need it, because we're not going to not provide energy to people.
I don't understand what exactly mental model you have of how the world works, but what are we going to shut down all the plants, drive everyone out of business, try to survive on these unreliables, which are complete failures, and then, oh, quote, if that doesn't work and we're all in poverty, we're going to build up everything again?
There's a little bit of irony, is that you so frequently accuse the green movement of dealing in catastrophes.
Oh, but human beings can cause catastrophes. Statism is what causes catastrophes. So you have statism causing communism, you have statism causing Nazism, you have statism causing the eugenics movement, you have statism causing the worldwide ban of DDT.
Statism also beat the Nazis and beat the Soviets.
No, I wouldn't call it. So statism is concentration of power in the state at the expense of the individual. Now, to protect individuals, sometimes you need to go to war. That's why you have a state. A state is a very good thing. But to put the state above the individual is bad. So governments can cause catastrophes. That's why I'm worried about this government-caused catastrophe in the making.
That's why you're worried about this government-caused catastrophe in the
This is a government-caused catastrophe in the making.
Right. Well, I lost you a little bit on statism. So you say that you'd like to influence the election this year, but you haven't followed politics much until fairly recently.
No, I follow it, but I've never been, a legislative intern or something like that.
I got you.
I'm aware of what's going on.
So there are two parties. No, do you know who Frank Luntz is?
Yes, I do.
All right. Well, Frank Luntz is like the most, in many ways, I think he's like one of the most powerful guys.
No, he's super, super influential.
Incredibly smart. I met him on a cruise, and talking to him it was a little thrilling, and he's so smart and so interesting, and he's an Americana expert. He knows a ton of American history. He essentially, as far as I know, came up with the term climate change instead of global warming, or at least.
Did he really?
Yeah.
He works for both sides.
Well, that was an effort because climate change doesn't scare people as much as global warming. So.
Oh no, there's a deliberate campaign for the opposite, because it wasn't getting warm enough. So people wanted to connect it to weather disasters.
Well,
so weather disasters are much.
His quote is that people won't be afraid of climate change; they'll be afraid of global warming. Yeah.
Oh well, thank you for telling me that. I did not know that.
He came up with the death tax.
I'm familiar with that one.
And he called the Affordable Care Act and made sure that every Republican called the Affordable Care Act government takeover.
Okay.
So I just mean, but I say that to suggest his impact, not to ascribe an opinion about it. Like he figured some important stuff out.
Yeah.
Back in 2002, given that studies that showed that if people believed there was a scientific consensus about something, they would be more likely to take action. Mm-hmm. If you're told every scientist believes X, 10 guys believe Y, oh, let's do X, right? He said in a leaked memo to his clients, his Republican clients, should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. What Luntz said there is very reminiscent of what the tobacco industry did in the late 50s when presented with overwhelming evidence that tobacco caused cancer, caused heart disease, caused birth defects. They hired some doctors to essentially offer the opposing point of view, which was not so much that it doesn't, but that, hey, we don't know.
Right.
The jury is out. And the jury is out is a very effective argument when you take something complicated that people don't know. And it strikes me that what's happened here with climate change is the industry has gotten some people to say, people who mean it legitimately. I don't think they've hired everybody and put them all on their payroll, although there is some of that. But they've gotten people to say, the jury's out. It's unclear what the science shows, and therefore do nothing. And that might buy the fossil fuel industry 10 more years of enormous profits, maybe 15, maybe 50. It's an effective strategy, and it strikes me that that's what's happening on your side.
Yeah, I think I have a problem with the whole idea of just saying, and I think different kinds of people say this, but, oh, the jury is out, therefore you don't have to think about it. Because with most of what we deal with in life, there are risks that have different degrees of uncertainty with them. So, for instance, the climate issue, runaway global warming, catastrophic climate change, was something I used to be genuinely afraid of. And I never found it that reassuring that somebody said, well, it might not be true. Because it might be true, right? Or it might be true to some magnitude. So with all these issues, what you need to do is you need to look carefully at, probabilities, or what is the real evidence for it, and you need to think about it carefully. And I think one interesting thing about the tobacco industry, and anyone can take this clip out of context, but is that because of that kind of narrative, people have an irrational view of how dangerous tobacco is. Now, I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, and obviously certain quantities of tobacco over time yield certain results, and there's a certain correlation to cancer, although it's not, an absolute cause, but it's a causal type relationship. And then with emphysema, I think it's more direct or whatever. But people have this idea, if you smoke 2 cigarettes, your life is over. So with everything, you just need to be really clear on objectively, here are the dangers of smoking, versus just smoking is the most evil thing in the world. That's going to ruin everyone's life, et cetera, et cetera.
No one was suggesting that 2 cigarettes would have given you.
But no, they do. Like when I was a kid.
Okay, I got you, but they're addictive.
Yeah, I mean, they have that kind of quality. So again, that's an unhealthy thing. I don't like the sort of binary, it's absolutely fatal, it's going to kill you tomorrow, or it's innocuous, or there's not certainty. So anyway, let's apply that to this kind of issue. So to my knowledge, I haven't studied the tobacco industry in depth, but there was obviously some misrepresentation, a lot of misrepresentation about it. Now, I do think that any industry has the right, if it's suspicious of certain people saying it's doing a lot of damage, to hear all different views, but it has an absolute responsibility to be honest about those, and the public can take that into account. Like the scientists should say, look, I got my funding from here, and the public can say, yeah, that's a potential biasing factor, we want to look at that. I think they have every right to do it. So I can tell you, though, with this issue, what I did, and this is before I even met one person from the fossil fuel industry, is I tried to look carefully at what is this consensus? What exactly are they agreeing on, and what are they not agreeing on? And this goes to the 97% issue. And what I found is that in the use of this very vague term climate change, or this very vague term global warming, you had in philosophy philosophy is my background, what's called an equivocation, where people are not clear whether by climate change they mean just climate is changing naturally, climate is changing a lot, man-made climate change, moderate man-made climate change, extreme man-made climate change, catastrophic climate change that we can't adapt to. And these kinds of distinctions are very important. And what you find with the 97% thing, and I have a section on this in the book, is that what people are agreeing on, insofar as the papers are being represented, is that by putting more infrared absorbers in the atmosphere, we're causing some warming effect, which makes total sense to me, since that's a demonstrable causal relationship. What's not proven is any of the climate models. What's not proven is dramatic warming, because there hasn't been any, and certainly not any of these projections about the future. So the profession has an obligation to acknowledge, look, we believe that this has contributed to some of the fairly moderate warming that has existed over the past, let's say, 80 years. And some of us think it might lead to this, and some of it might lead to that, but none of us has a functional climate model that confirms our theory that somehow this effect is going to be a dramatically warming effect. So I think the profession has been very dishonest, and the talk of consensus is dishonest. And if people look at any of the pages that describe consensus with the idea of equivocation, they'll see that it equivocates left and right.
And you think that the movement, for lack of a better word, is as motivated to scare us about climate change as the industry is to make us believe that there's nothing to fear? I don't see what
They're much more successful.
I would argue they're not as successful because we haven't really seen it yet. But
we haven't seen what?
We haven't seen significant in California. We've seen a movement. We've seen some successful legislation in Colorado, but we haven't seen it anywhere else. We haven't seen a national movement. We haven't changed our energy policy.
In Europe, you have it all over the place. I mean, it often occurs first. So often what happens is first you have mandates, then you have bans. So you have a lot of mandates. So I was in Belgium recently doing some speaking, and they talked about how in the past couple of years, because of these, I would call them unreliables mandates, their prices have gone up by a factor of 3.
What's the motivation of the movement? What is the motivation? We talked about this earlier, but you just...
It's a belief that it's wrong for man to transform nature.
And you think that's more powerful than an industry fighting to hang on to its billions?
So that I think is the premise that's in people's minds. So the premise that it's wrong to change nature also includes the premise that the planet is our fragile mother, and that for us to disrupt it is necessarily going to lead to catastrophe. So it has this fragile view of the planet, plus this view that the ideal is for us to not impact it. So look, I think of things in terms of philosophy, but if you look at the institutions, what you find is that people have incredible incentives. And it's not, I'm not a guy who's really into people being paid off. I don't think that's really what runs the world. I think it's that in these different professions, people's jobs and prestige is the most underrated human motivator. Their prestige depends on believing that there is this crisis that we need to solve by restricting fossil fuels. Certainly, this is just a fact. If you talk to, you go on my show, listen to my podcast, Power Hour, we have climate scientists, they'll tell you that for every one of them who expresses any disagreement with catastrophic climate change, they get letters from dozens of people who are afraid to because they'll lose their job. I know somebody who is an aspiring climate scientist. He didn't go into the field after getting a PhD from one of the top universities in the country because if he said his views, he would be deported because he was...
I don't doubt that there's some groupthink involved there. I don't doubt that you heard from those people and that those people have heard from others who wish to express the same.
There's huge incentives. It takes a lot to get a scientist to shut up.
I just don't see that incentive as powerful as what would be the fossil fuels industry.
Well, but the fossil fuel industry, in my view here, is not doing anything wrong because there is not a climate catastrophe. So if there was, then their incentive would be really malicious. But if they're protecting their right to produce a really valuable product.
I know a lot of scientists, man, and they are fiercely independent and they believe in the science.
What is the science? You have to be clear.
I got it.
Do they understand how the greenhouse effect works?
Probably,
how do they explain the climate models? A lot don't.
I'm sure many don't, but many do. And the notion that they would run the risk of what you're saying, which is drive millions back into poverty and create a sunlight-free world where no one can plug anything in and we all live to 32 because they're afraid to say, actually, I'm not sure? That sounds like horseshit.
Well, we know that cultures do this sorts of thing all the time, and they often do it in the name of science. So how is it that in the United States, you had many of the leading intellectuals and scientists endorse a eugenics movement and force sterilization? Why did that happen? Your friends, some of your scientist friends could have been back then and they could have said, yeah, I looked at some of this and it makes a certain amount of sense, and they had this idea of global dumbing. We're dumbing the gene pool by too many stupid people sleeping with one another, and we got to put a stop to that, so we got to sterilize the bad couples, and they had their own kind of internal argument.
I know, we didn't allow...
So science with a capital S is used dogmatically to cause a huge amount of the oppression that has existed in the modern world. It was used in Nazi Germany, it's used in the Soviet Union.
Here's what has been used to cause more of the problems in the world. Corporate greed has beaten science.
Really?
Yes, 100%. And so
100 million people die under communism. That's not corporate greed because there's no corporations.
Yes, granted.
So I take it back.
No, I'm not going to take it back.
Corporate greed has caused more than statist collectivist regimes that murder...
I'm not talking about statist collectivist regimes. I'm talking about your out of left field point that science has, over the course of by using your example of eugenics, that science is a dangerous thing that we need to fear.
I gave the other examples as well. You have the eugenics movement.
All I'm suggesting is that I don't really believe what I'm saying about corporate greed, but I certainly don't believe what you're saying about science.
It's not that science is a methodology. As I said, science with a capital S as a dogmatic institution. So what happens is...
I'm not talking about science with a capital S as a dogmatic.
I'm talking about science. And Eisenhower actually warned about this, having a state scientific, quote unquote, establishment whose priorities are set by the government, that gets very entrenched, that takes monopolistic positions, that is very reluctant to abandon. This is how you can have worldwide restrictions and bans on DDT, which is one of the healthiest substances ever, and this cost tens of millions of lives. The scientific, quote unquote, community accepted this. So I'm not afraid to attack anybody who's acting against human life. They are not being the method of science is the greatest thing in the world. A dogmatic person who uses science to attack people, to attack freedom, to attack reason is a scumbag.
The Pope issued an encyclical
Yes.
on climate change. I take it he was wrong.
Well, it's interesting because it's on the fundamental issue we're talking about, which is the relationship between man and nature. And what he's saying is that we are really polluter parasites who are making the earth filthy and who are depleting its resources. And I believe that no, we're improver producers. We improve the planet on balance. And the most revealing statement in his document was talking about how we've made the earth an enormous pile of filth. And to me, that is an anti-human view, because if the Pope 300 years ago could be transported here and look at our environment and our world overall, taking both the positive and negative changes, he would be blown away. He'd say, this is the healthiest place I can imagine. You guys did great. And so the fact that the Pope is against our transformation of nature makes it logical that he'd be against fossil fuels, which was one of our most consequential transformations of nature.
The Pope put the blame on certain types of people. I'm going to read from the encyclical. Big businesses, energy companies, short-sighted politicians, scurrilous scientists, laissez-faire economists, indifferent individuals, callous Christians, and myopic media professionals. To some extent, you fit maybe three of those. You could fit big businesses, you work for them. You could certainly fit energy companies and myopic media professionals. I mean, he could also be talking about me there, but he called you out a little.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't deal well with authorities. So I understand that a lot of people follow the Pope and the Catholic Church, but I go by what people's reasons are. And I think the whole philosophy that he's espousing there is an anti-human philosophy. It's an anti-modifying nature philosophy. And he can call me, whatever he wants. I find it pretty presumptuous that he's talking science now, given the history of the Catholic Church and science. And I find it a little bit alarming that people are citing him as a scientific authority because he was some sort of chemist once.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Are you in favor of the Iran nuclear deal?
No.
Why not? We lift the sanctions, they'll have money, they'll produce oil. That's good for the world.
This goes to the whole issue of foreign policy. And are we really taking...
I'm not wrong though, right? There'll be a lot more fossil fuels available if the sanctions are lifted against Iran.
Yeah, and there was more commerce. There was more commerce, before World War II, once we started selling Japan more jet fuel. I still don't think that was a good policy.
Yeah, I'm not interested in that.
Well, but the question is, the context in which energy and markets and competition arises is the context of governments that are supposed to protect people's rights. So this is a bigger subject than what we're talking about here. But this goes to what are my views on foreign policy? What are my views on the threat or non-threat that a country like Iran poses? How do you deal with that? But if you look historically, one of the effective ways to deal with a country is not the kind of policy we have now, which I don't think makes much sense. But if you really wanted to bring a country to its knees in non-military fashion, one thing you could do, if you could pull it off, would be to organize a worldwide embargo if you had some specific plan. But to explain my full view on what people can look it up on the internet, what I think about Iran.
But it's good for a world that needs oil. That's good, right?
Yes, but foreign policy, taking the wrong foreign policy action is deadly for everybody.
Is fracking dangerous?
Everything has some danger. It has no unique dangers. It's actually one of the safer parts of the process of producing oil. We can talk about why, but basically things that threaten groundwater tend to be really close to groundwater. So lots of things can threaten groundwater. We have to pay attention to them and try to make sure they don't happen. But fracking is 5,000 plus feet away. The reason it's gotten a lot of attention is because it has an unfamiliar and somewhat harsh sounding name of fracking.
It does have a bad name. Should it, bare minimum, is it fair for the government to significantly regulate it?
Well, it already is, so that's the whole issue of the quote Halliburton loophole, which is a misrepresentation of the situation. The question is who should pass the laws, who should enforce the laws. I think generally it should be done on a state level or even a community level by people who are closest to the situation.
Unless the community wants to prevent the fracking, in which
right,
case,
so you have to decide, the sort of national policy. But in terms
there
of...
was great hypocrisy there when the town, I can't remember where, you probably do, tried to prevent the fracking, and then all of a sudden, no, then it's the state.
Right, no, so this is, I think, in general, something that the industry does poorly, which is not say exactly what the policy should be, what the principle is, and why. So right now I'm working on I've talked about policy, but formulating my own kind of national energy policy, tentatively called Energy Abundance Plan. And part of the goal there is to give a principled, consistent thing that says, look, here's what communities should do, here's what the state should do. I mean, anytime you contradict yourself, you lose credibility.
Right, okay, well, they did lose credibility there. You guys use the term intermittency.
You guys?
Yeah, you defenders of fossil fuels, you guys. You use the term intermittency, which I think is the correct term, regarding wind and solar. Am I correct?
Describing how sunlight and wind come to the earth, yes. I use the term unreliables a lot, which people in those industries like less, but it's accurate, so too bad.
Well, I like actually the term unreliables just from a Frank Luntz wordplay. I know he'd respect it because it is a good combative word in contrast to renewables.
Well, I'm no Frank Luntz, but I try to come up with my own. I have climate scientologist, climastrologist for the people who can't predict the future of climate. So, you try to come up with material over time.
So, but why are wind and solar unreliable?
Well, so it comes from the basic intermittency of the input. And so that, then you have to find a way to process that input in a way that's reliable. And to do that, what you would need just on its own is you'd need a huge amount of storage to store it and then redeploy it. So you'd always have a certain amount of battery reserve no matter what. And then you could handle it. So if somebody lives off grid, this is more or less what happens, right? So somebody lives off grid, it's too there are no power lines to his house. What they'll have is they'll have some solar panels and they'll have some batteries, and they can't have that much electricity, and it's much more expensive. But they make do, and that's a choice that people can make. If you tried to do that here, that means many people would be poor who couldn't afford that, and then also industry couldn't function. These people off grid are not powering, they're not manufacturing shoes or running agricultural equipment. Or something like that. So what's happened is because the resource, it's so resource intensive to try to produce that much storage, what happens with these forms of energy is they're stuck on a network with reliables. And so they end up just being on life support from the unreliables. The unreliables rather end up being on life support from the reliables. And this is why you have the costs go up. And really, if you took the reliables off the grid, you'd be just fine. I'm mixing my terms today. If you took the unreliables, this is the problem with this term. Right. It's so easy to say the wrong one. So maybe Frank Luntz will give me a better one. But if you take the unreliables off the grid, if you shut them down, you're pretty much okay. If you take 20% of the reliables off the grid, it's a complete mess.
Isn't it valuable for the state, which you're afraid of, and I am absolutely not, because it is, I think, more than anything else.
I'm afraid of violating rights. I like being protected.
We agree. It's a question of when we start to feel that threat is real.
I agree, but I'm glad there are police officers, although I don't like when they act badly, but it's that kind of thing.
No, I'm in favor of police officers too, but I don't like it when they act badly either. Isn't it valuable for the state, whatever that means, in this case it would mean the federal government, to incentivize wind and solar, the unreliables, the intermittents, so that they can continue to develop technology which would, if it could provide the same thing that fossil fuels do, that's a win, right?
I don't believe in the government incentivizing anything in terms of a competitive market. So, why not? There's a great example that Jimmy Fallon gave he talked about hazelnut energy, because there was this quote unquote discovery, we can use hazelnuts to power cars. And he said, well, yeah, that's great, because a little thing of these costs about $9. Well, hazelnuts are a form of renewable energy. They involve the sun. They're a biofuel. But the point is they're really resource inefficient. That's why we don't use them. So the way to figure out which are the most resource efficient, which means cheap, plentiful, reliable technologies, is to have competition. And neither solar nor wind are new. I mean, wind, the core of it is medieval energy.
Does the federal government get to regulate anything?
And solar, the basic technology of solar has been around over 100 years. It depends what you mean by regulate. Regulate is based on this idea that when you have clear laws that protect property and liberty, that somehow things will go crazy and the government needs to make them regular. So I believe in clear laws protecting individual rights, including air and water. But the term regulation is woozy and often used, I think, to violate people's rights.
Yeah, well, we have a fundamental disagreement of the role of government.
Well,
That's
we can,
clear.
let's, next show, role of government.
All right, real quick, is there a candidate on the Republican side who, regarding energy, strikes you as a good candidate?
I think, for me, the big question is going to be, what's their real platform on energy? And none of them have a coherent, positive, inspiring platform right now, which is why my focus is, I want to make energy a winning issue for the side that agrees with me generally. So my focus is, I'm creating what I call the energy abundance plan, and I am going to encourage all of my alleged fat cat friends in industry and everyone else, if it's really good, promote the heck out of it to these candidates and try to get them to learn about it. I'm going to try to get grassroots people, because it's ultimately about having a really good argument. In 2008, 2012, Republicans got creamed on energy. So if I'm right, and if human life can be benefited by liberating all forms of energy, including fossil fuels, including nuclear, including hydro, including solar and wind, if I'm right about that, then the Republicans need to learn how to message it. Otherwise the right side is going to lose. No pun intended.
Alex, thank you.
All right,
That was
thanks.
a lot of fun. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.